There's a belief the 1,000-year reign of Yeshua has already passed, and we're now in the time when Satan is loosed. This is Off the Cuff, and I'm Steve from TorahFamily.org. Let's talk about it. Okay, I'm telling you now, this is going to be one long teaching. There's just so much to cover. So, if you're a prophecy student, you may want to put the speed at 2x. Okay, let's begin. There are multiple varying views to this understanding of how we're currently in the season when Satan is loosed after the millennium. It comes from the preterist understanding. The general belief is the tribulation occurred when Rome came against Israel in AD 66 through 70. They believe Yeshua returned at the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, that being the Battle of Armageddon. They believe Yeshua's been reigning since then, and the 1,000 years, whether literal or figurative, has now passed, and we're now in the time when Satan is loosed at the end of those 1,000 years. There's no time allocated to how long Satan is loosed, so that gives them liberty in saying he could be loose for hundreds of years, even up to 1,000 years. If you hold to any version of this view, I pray you watch all of this teaching and consider carefully what's presented. If you don't hold to this view, I pray you also watch all of this teaching and consider carefully why this view is wrong. 4 general views. In short, there are 4 general views to prophecy. The preterist view. It believes all prophecy has been completed. Then you have the historicist view. It believes prophecy unfolds over history. The futurist view. It believes prophecy regarding Yeshua's return is yet to happen. And finally, you have the idealist. This view holds that everything in prophecy is simply metaphors and pretty much nothing more. Please know, there are varying differences with each of these understandings. In this teaching, we'll be looking at a particular understanding from the preterist view, that which is considered partial preterism. And please know, there are multiple views even in this understanding. Early belief. Many who hold to the preterist view will say the futurist view, the view that's still waiting for Yeshua's return, didn't come around until John Nelson Darby in the 1800s. They say it was then rapidly spread in the 1900s, namely from the Schofield Bible. However, the futurist view of looking for Yeshua's return didn't start in the 1800s. It doesn't take much research to see what believers held to after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Polycarp is a prime example. He's among the earliest believers whose writings survived. Jerome wrote that Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John and by him ordained presbyter of Smyrna. Polycarp was an elder of a congregation that contributed much to the founding of the Christian church. The writing of Polycarp is addressed to the church of Philippi. It's believed to be a compilation gathered from 2 different writings in the first half of the 2nd century. So it's well after 70 AD. So what we see in his writing to Philippi gives us what understanding Polycarp, the disciple of John the Revelator, had long after 70 AD. Let's see what Polycarp had to say. Polycarp, chapter 1, verse 2. And that the steadfast root of your faith, which was famed from primitive times, abideth until now, and beareth fruit unto our Lord Jesus Christ, who endured the face, even death for our sins, whom God raised, having loosed the pangs of Hades. Now, why didn't Polycarp mention Yeshua's return? I mean, wouldn't that have been something of equal importance to note? Why didn't he say also, and who already returned in keeping his word? But he didn't. Let's look at the next chapter. Polycarp chapter 2, verse 1. Wherefore, gird up your loins, and serve God in fear and truth, forsaking the vain and empty talking, and the error of the many. For that ye have believed on him that raised our Lord Jesus Christ from the dead, and gave unto him glory, and a throne on his right hand, unto whom all things were made subject, that are in heaven and that are on the earth, to whom every creature that hath breath doeth service, whom cometh as judge of quick and dead, whose blood God will require of them that are disobedient unto him. Now please notice the return of Yeshua is future tense to Polycarp. And make no mistake, if Yeshua had already come in 70 AD and Polycarp was simply discussing another coming of Yeshua, he would have noted it. This is huge, yet all too often overlooked. Continuing, Polycarp chapter 2, verse 2. Now, he that raised him from the dead will raise us also, if we do his will and walk in his commandments, and love the things which he loved, abstaining from all unrighteousness, covetousness, love of money, evil speaking, false witness, not rendering evil for evil, or railing for railing, or blow for blow, or cursing for cursing. Notice he said, now he that raised him from the dead will raise us also. Now, if one wants to say Polycarp is talking here about the second resurrection at the end of the millennium, then he would have said, now, he that raised him from the dead, and those also at his second coming, will raise us also. But he didn't. He only references Yeshua's resurrection, because Yeshua hadn't returned yet. In chapter 7, you can see the influence of John in Polycarp's writing. Polycarp chapter 7, verse 1. For everyone who shall not confess that Jesus Christ come in the flesh is Antichrist. And whosoever shall not confess the testimony of the cross is of the devil. And whosoever shall pervert the oracles of the Lord to his own lusts, and say that there is neither resurrection nor judgment, that man is the firstborn of Satan. Notice the latter part of this verse. He references the teachings of Yeshua about the resurrection and judgment. Why reference Yeshua's teachings on it? Because if they had already happened, he would have referenced 70 AD. But since it didn't happen in 70 AD, he references Yeshua's teachings on them. Polycarp chapter 9, verse 2. Being persuaded that all these ran not in vain, but in faith and righteousness, and that they are in their due place in the presence of the Lord, with whom also they suffered. For they love not the present world, but him that died for our sakes, and was raised by God for us. Again, no mention of his second coming. What a perfect place to say, and came again, just as he said. But he didn't say that because it didn't happen yet. Polycarp chapter 12, verse 2. Now, may the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the eternal high priest himself, the Son of God, Jesus Christ, build you up in faith and truth, and in all gentleness, and in all avoidance of wrath, and in forbearance, and long-suffering, and in patient endurance and in purity. And may he grant unto you a lot and portion among his saints, and to us with you, and to all that are under heaven, who shall believe on our Lord and God Jesus Christ, and on his Father that raised him from the dead. Again, no mention of his second coming. Nowhere in the Epistle of Polycarp do we see any mention of Yeshua's second coming in 70 AD, but rather the anticipation of it yet to happen. If Polycarp wasn't enough for you, what about the Apostles' Creed? The expression Apostles' Creed is first mentioned in a letter from the Council of Milan dated AD 390. That's 220 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. It's said that each of the 12 apostles contributed an article to the 12 articles of the Creed. It's the 7th article that needs to be taken note of. It says, "Who will come again to judge the living and the dead." Who will come, not who has come. Now, regardless if you hold to this creed or not, the point is, believers at that time believed Yeshua was still yet to return. They didn't believe he came in 70 AD. So, from Polycarp to the Council of Milan, we see the early church after 70 AD was still waiting for the return of Yeshua. There was no such thing as a preterist back then. Now, that being the case, when did the view of preterism come to be? What would be the motive to say it happened in the past? The preterist view was created in the 17th century by a Jesuit named Louis de Alcazar. He lived from 1554 to 1613. His purpose was to defend the Catholic Church against the attacks of the Reformation movement. He attributed the tribulation to the fall of Israel and the great apostasy to the first century church. You see, the Reformers were preaching that Mystery Babylon in Revelation 17 was Rome. Being under control of the Catholic Church for so long, they began taking on the historicist view. The Protestants were abandoning the Catholic Church in droves. The Jesuits set out to stop the revolt. So, the doctrine of preterism came to be. The very term preterist is Latin, the very language of the Catholic Church and the Jesuit priests used at that time. It means past. Thus, preterists believe Bible prophecy was fulfilled in the past. Next, the prophets. When discussing the return of Yeshua, we have to look at what the prophets said. So, let's begin. First, Hosea tells us bow, sword, and battle will be abolished. This is done through the Battle of Armageddon. Thus, the Battle of Armageddon will be the last battle ever fought on earth. This goes in perfect harmony with Micah 4:3 and Isaiah 2:4. In both of these verses, we see where they beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations no longer takes up sword against nations, and they won't train for war anymore. So, if Armageddon happened in 70 AD, when did war and training for war stop? Fact is, it didn't stop. War has continued ever since 70 AD, showing us what? Armageddon didn't happen in 70 AD. There won't even be a battle at the end of Satan's season of being loosed. Even though they gather around Jerusalem for war, it won't happen. Revelation chapter 20 verse 9 shows fire coming down from heaven, destroying them all. There is no war. Why? Because Yahweh is keeping his word. No more war after Armageddon. Period. I believe those who hold to this view just don't understand how this prophecy of no war alone pulls the rug out from under all their interpretations. Some might try to say, well, Steve, it's just spiritual. Okay, so you're telling me spiritual warfare ceased after 70 AD? Do you really believe that? The very fact that Satan is loosed at the end of the millennium proves spiritual warfare isn't done away with. But that's what many try to do. They try to spiritualize what they can't explain. The point being here, though, war has not ceased since 70 AD. Thus, 70 AD wasn't the time of Armageddon. But let's continue with more of the context from what we saw in Micah chapter 2 and Isaiah 4. These verses are virtually identical, both discussing the millennial kingdom under Yeshua. So, when have the nations said, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of Yahweh, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths"? Seriously, we know the answer. It hasn't. When has the law gone out from Zion, the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem? And when has he been judged between many peoples and settled disputes for strong nations far and wide? Well, he hasn't. This is evidence from all the wars throughout history. This isn't just one prophet. No, this is two prophets saying virtually the exact same thing, word for word. These prophets are showing us 70 AD couldn't be the time for Armageddon. And what about Isaiah 11:6 and Isaiah 65:25? When has the wolf and the lamb ever lived together? These two verses show peace comes upon the animal kingdom just the same during the reign of Yeshua. So, when did the wolf lie down with the lamb? Many will try to say, "Well, Steve, that's just spiritual too." Okay, when has the spiritual wolves not gone after the spiritual lambs? Again, the spiritual application doesn't apply here either. But let's look at Isaiah 11 a little deeper to keep the context. Verse 1 through 3 shows it's discussing Yeshua. Verses 3 through 5 shows it's how he'll rule in a time of peace after he destroys the wicked at Armageddon. Verses 6 through 9 shows it's not just the wolf and the lamb that will live in peace. It's the whole animal kingdom. And the animal kingdom will be at peace with man. And the knowledge of Yahweh covers the earth. Verses 10 through 12. When have the nations rallied to Yeshua? They haven't. And when has Jerusalem been glorious? Are you getting the picture yet? Verses 11 through 12 specifically references the second Exodus, when he gathers all the exiles of his people from all over the world. Folks, this hasn't happened yet, and it happens right after the Battle of Armageddon. Please see our teaching, the second Exodus, for more details on that. Verses 13 and 14 shows the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel reunited in peace, and they plunder those who plundered them. And please notice where it says Judah will not be hostile toward Ephraim. To this day, most devout Jews are jealous of any Gentile pursuing the Torah. In fact, this is why we see in Revelation the enemy going after those who hold to the testimony of Yeshua and keep the commands of Yahweh. Verses 15 and 16 shows Yahweh making a way for those who will be on the second Exodus. Even if one wants to try and spiritualize these verses, you simply can't spiritualize the house of Israel being back together. They aren't together in any way, and they won't be together until Yeshua returns. All of that was the context for Isaiah 11:6. Now, let's look at the context for Isaiah 65, verse 25. Some try to say the context here is eternity after the millennium, with the new heaven and new earth. They say that because of what's said in verse 17. It says, "Behold, I will create new heavens and a new earth. The former things will not be remembered, nor will they come to mind." Immediately they say, "See, this is after the millennium." But they forget this is just an interjection of saying what's to come. Verse 18 transitions us right back to what comes first. "But be glad and rejoice forever in what I will create. For I will create Jerusalem to be a delight, and its people a joy. A rebuttal is then quickly given for what is said in the next verse. Verse 19. It reads, I will rejoice over Jerusalem, and take delight in my people. The sound of weeping and of crying will be heard in it no more. They say, see, there's no more weeping or crying. This matches perfectly to Revelation 21, verse 4. But what they're missing is that verse 19 says there will be no more weeping or crying in Jerusalem. It doesn't say there's no more weeping or crying at all. So, why specifically mention Jerusalem regarding this? Because by this point in history, Jerusalem will have been destroyed by invaders multiple times over. But now, the city, whose very name means city of peace, will have peace with no concern of destruction from invaders ever again. There will never be crying or weeping in her again because she will never see destruction again. However, the verse in Revelation says there will be no more crying or weeping at all, and it says there will be no more death. It then gives the reason why. The old order of things has passed away. Remember, it says no more death. That all being said, let's now read the context to Isaiah 65:25, starting at verse 20. Never again will there be in it an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not live out his years. He who dies at 100 will be thought a mere youth. He who fails to reach 100 will be considered accursed. So, what's this show us? There will be death. So, this is during the millennium and not in eternity. Then we see houses are built, vineyards are planted. Revelation 21 said the old order of things has passed. But we see here in Isaiah 65, the order is the same. His people will be walking in his blessings because they're walking in his ways. Next, during and after the 1,000-year reign of Yeshua, the Ark of the Covenant will never come to mind. This is seen in Jeremiah chapter 3. Verse 14 is a direct reference to the second Exodus here. Notice how verse 15 says, in the land. So, it's not just about their numbers increasing. It's about them being in the land. Then Yahweh says it. Men will no longer say, the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh. It will never enter their minds or be remembered. It will not be missed, nor will another one be made. Folks, this is huge. And yet, for the last 3,500 years, the Ark has been the most sought-after artifact in the history of mankind, and still is to this day. There have been models of it made, paintings of it made, drawings of it made, all over the last 3,500 years. They even made a movie about it. So either Jeremiah is a false prophet, or this theology of preterism is wrong. How could the time of Yeshua's reign have happened if the ark is still coming to mind and being sought after? When the ark comes out, anyone who holds to the view of us being in the time when Satan is loosed will have to confess they've been wrong. To keep the context, let's continue reading with the following two verses. Verse 17. At that time, they will call Jerusalem the throne of Yahweh, and all nations will gather in Jerusalem to honor the name of Yahweh. No longer will they follow the stubbornness of their evil hearts. Again, it's about the nations gathering to Jerusalem. And it says the nations no longer follow the stubbornness of their evil hearts. We obviously know this hasn't happened yet. Continuing, Verse 18, "In those days the house of Judah will join the house of Israel, and together they will come from the northland to the land I gave their forefathers as an inheritance." Again, we see it's the time of the two houses of Israel coming back together under Yeshua. So the context is clear. It's regarding the reign of Yeshua. And during that time, the Ark of the Covenant will not be thought of or remembered anymore. Continuing on, Zechariah 14 tells us the Mount of Olives will literally split in two at the time of the Battle of Armageddon. This obviously didn't happen in 70 AD. The Mount of Olives is still there in one piece. Ezekiel 39 says all the weapons from the battle will be used for fuel for 7 years. There's no record of anything like that taking place in Jerusalem after 70 AD. When Yeshua comes, the new covenant begins. It's a marriage, the marriage of the Lamb as given in Revelation. It's seen taking place immediately after the destruction of Babylon in Revelation chapter 18, verse 4 through chapter 19, verse 9. It just so happens this marriage covenant is seen here in Hosea, where he says he betroths us and we will call him our husband. So, this takes place immediately after the destruction of Babylon, that which preterists say was Jerusalem in 70 AD. But the wedding of the Lamb is the new covenant, that which is prophesied through Jeremiah in chapter 31. But notice verse 34. It says, "No longer will a man teach his neighbor, or a man his brother, saying, 'Know Yahweh,' because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares Yahweh." To this day, believers are still witnessing for people to know Yahweh, showing us what? The new wedding covenant hasn't happened yet. Thus, Babylon of Revelation hasn't been destroyed yet. This shows Yeshua hasn't come yet. This new covenant, where Yahweh puts his law in our minds and writes it on our hearts, is the same that is referred to in Ezekiel 36. It's when he gathers us from the nations. It's when we live in the land, and the land will be restored. And, as given in that same context, we see Ezekiel 37. It's when Yeshua unites the two kingdoms back together again, as noted in the other prophets. He brings the two sticks of Israel back together. This happens at the new covenant when Yeshua returns. This hasn't happened yet. 70 AD was a judgment that came only on Judah, a judgment that they themselves declared to happen. When they had Yeshua standing before Pilate, they said, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." And it was. That happened in 70 AD when Jerusalem was conquered. But it wasn't the end-time judgments prophesied to come. You see, the prophets say judgment is coming on both kingdoms at the same time in the end. Ezekiel 4 shows destruction coming to Jerusalem that first begins with a 40-day siege. But what's often forgotten is how Ezekiel shows the northern kingdom will be judged at the same time. In fact, the text shows the surrounding of Jerusalem will be a sign to the northern kingdom that their judgment is coming too. What many don't seem to know is how these verses here in Ezekiel 4 is what Yeshua is directly referencing when he talks about seeing Jerusalem getting surrounded in Luke chapter 21, verses 20 through 22. But again, 70 AD was only a judgment on the southern kingdom. That's it. The northern kingdom wasn't judged. Another concerning element is how preterism ignores the promise of the land. As noted already, we see where Yahweh promises to bring his people back to the land under the kingship of Yeshua. But preterism ignores those prophecies. When they do that, they make Yahweh out to be a covenant breaker. You see, Yahweh made an unconditional promise to Abraham that he would give the land to Abraham's descendants forever. He never said, if you do this, then I'll do that. No, it was an unconditional covenant. The land was to be theirs. And so we see the land given to them under Yeshua's reign when he comes and brings them all back together again. This is huge, but completely ignored by the preterist view. Moses even prophesied about the final battle that enables his people to all be gathered back to the land. It's seen here in Deuteronomy 32. Notice where he says, "For he will avenge the blood of his servants." Sound familiar? Consider what's said in Revelation chapter 6. The martyrs under the altar in heaven asks when he will avenge their blood. They were told to wait a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and brothers who were to be killed as they were had been completed. The fifth seal here in Revelation is a direct reference to Deuteronomy 32. It will be completed at the Battle of Armageddon. But again, the preterist view completely dismisses any prophecy regarding the land being given back at Armageddon. Regarding the land, we can't forget the prophecy of the coming temple through Ezekiel. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going to read all of Ezekiel chapter 40, verses 5 through 49. However, I do encourage you to read it all. In it, you'll see Ezekiel's vision of the coming temple is much different than either of the two previous temples. This shows a future temple will be built, and the surrounding complex of the temple will be much different. We know this temple will be during the millennium because after the millennium, in eternity, there won't be a temple on earth, as seen here in Revelation chapter 21, verse 22. Now, I know many will try to say, but we are the temple now. Steve, don't you know? But what many don't know is that Paul is quoting Exodus and Leviticus when he tells us this. Let's read it. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, starting in verse 16. What agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? For we are the temple of the living God, as God has said. Okay, here it is. He's about to show why we are God's temple. How does he do it? He quotes the Torah. I will live with them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. This is Paul's foundation for saying we are the temple. It's Leviticus chapter 26, verse 12, and also Exodus chapter 29, verse 45. It's the Torah. This is not a New Testament concept. Since this concept Paul presents is founded from the Torah, you can't justify saying we replaced the temple, because when Yahweh spoke these words, the physical tabernacle was there. So knowing this fact, you can't use that argument to say the temple Ezekiel prophesies about is supposed to be talking about us. The prophets all point to the restoration of the kingdom of Israel coming back to the land being restored, and restoration of peace and harmony for all creation. That being said, consider what Luke said in Acts chapter 3. Acts chapter 3, verse 21. He must remain in heaven until the time comes for God to restore everything as he promised long ago through his holy prophets. So, Was everything restored in 70 AD? No, not even close. Showing us Yeshua did not come in 70 AD. He didn't establish his rule in the land with bringing restoration to the two houses of Israel and harmony restored to all creation. It simply didn't happen. It's still yet to come. The prophets discuss a literal physical resurrection. Paul understood that to be the case as well. In Acts 17, he was even made fun of by others for believing in it. That leads us to our next topic, 3 resurrections. Paul discusses 3 resurrections. This is seen in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 20 through 24. The first, of course, is Yeshua, noted here as the first fruits. The next happens when Yeshua returns. Then the last resurrection happens at the end when Yeshua hands the kingdom over to Yahweh. Now, please notice I have the words will come scratched out. That's because they don't exist in the Greek. Thus, the last resurrection is at the end. It's not the end will come. He's concluding his statement on the timing of the 3 resurrections. That's his focus. Thus, at the end. But we see here the next resurrection takes place when Yeshua returns. Many try to spiritualize this event to make it fit 70 AD. But as noted in 1 Corinthians 15, we know Yeshua was physically resurrected with a glorified body. Knowing that, how could the resurrection of the saints at his coming be spiritual only? John said we would be just like him when he returns. Just like him. So, when he returns, the resurrection will indeed be physical. And, as we see here in John 14, Yeshua specifically says he will gather us and take us to be with him, just like the prophets said. And we know from these verses in John chapter 6, Yeshua said he will raise them up on the last day. The prophets have mentioned the resurrection on multiple occasions. Isaiah gives specific reference to it here in chapter 26. He said the dead will live and their bodies will rise. Their bodies will rise, specifically citing it as a birth. So it's not something spiritual. Speaking again of that birth, Isaiah references it again in chapter 66, verses 7 and 8. Then Ezekiel references the bones coming back together and breath entering their bodies. And it's important to note this is directly related with the new covenant mentioned in the previous chapter. Daniel also gives direct reference to the resurrection in chapter 12. And even David prophesies of the resurrection in the Psalms, Psalm 49:15 and Psalm 71, verse 20. So let there be no mistake. The resurrection will indeed be physical, and the next one happens at Yeshua's return for the new covenant. Paul references it again in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. He confirms what he said in 1 Corinthians regarding it taking place when Yeshua comes for all those who belong to him, and it starts with the dead being raised. This is important to note because preterists try to spiritualize these verses like so many others, but Paul distinctly confirms it's all who belong to Yeshua, the dead and the living. And it starts with the dead, just like the prophets declare. Next, soon. Now that we see what the prophets said and saw the resurrection will indeed be physical, we need to look at how the preterist view misuses the word soon. They're quick to jump to the words of Yeshua in Revelation chapter 1. Let's go there. Revelation chapter 1, verse 1. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John. This is the Greek word for the word soon here. It means literally to do something fast, quick, in haste, to happen fast and all at once, not something that's spread out over much time. In fact, here's the phrase it's used in. The Greek literally says, what must happen with quickness. The word can be read in the sense that the action itself is to be done with speed and no delays. Not that the action itself is soon coming, but rather when it's done quickly. Just as we see it properly interpreted here in Luke chapter 18, verse 8, and Acts 12:7. Luke 18:8 says, I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? Meaning, when the justice comes, it's not drawn out. It happens quickly. But isn't it interesting how Yeshua references his return in this verse? Asking if he'll find faith when he comes. Why? Because though the judgment happens quickly when it comes, it doesn't happen quickly. Acts 12:7. Suddenly, an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him up. Quick, get up, he said, and the chains fell off Peter's wrists. Meaning, don't get up slowly, make the action quick. Just as the word is used in the first chapter of Revelation, it's used in the last chapter of Revelation as well. Revelation 22, verse 6. The angel said to me, these words are trustworthy and true. The Lord, the God of the spirits of the prophets, sent his angel to show his servants the things that must soon take place. And yes, it's the exact same phrase from chapter 1. The Greek literally says, what must happen with quickness. Changes everything, doesn't it? So, it's not discussing the timing of when something will happen, but rather the speed of the event when it does happen. Next, Daniel's understanding. There's an important element about Daniel that preterists overlook. Daniel was told to seal it all up. He was told none of the wicked would understand, but those who are wise will understand. So, if that's the case, why can none of the preterists give clear understanding to their view? Daniel was clearly told the understanding will be given to the wise. That means there would be no questions, as it would all be made clear. However, preterists themselves divide over how it was completed and can't answer many questions to their view and are forced to spiritualize an answer. So, how was the tribulation completed and yet no one has the clear understanding? We'll come back to this a little later. Next, Josephus. Those who hold to the preterist view rely heavily to an account given by Josephus. Josephus was the son of a priest who was with the crowd that cried, "Crucify him," and "Let his blood be on us and our children." And Josephus was an individual who turned on his own people for self-preservation. Now, while I have many concerns of Josephus, let's assume for a moment all his recordings are 100% correct and completely unbiased. Many hold to this account given by Josephus and claim the account was the fulfillment of Yeshua's coming on the clouds with his angels. The account reads, "Besides these signs, a few days after that feast, on the 21st day of the month, Artemis, Iar, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable, were it not related to those that saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For before sun setting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding of cities. Moreover, at that feast, which we call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple, as their custom was, to perform their sacred ministrations, they said that, in the first place, they felt a quaking, and heard a great noise, and after that they heard a sound as of a great multitude saying, "Let us remove hence." Well, there you go, Steve. That's all the proof you need. That's a first-hand account. Okay, first, notice the timing Josephus says this happens. It's the 21st day of the month of Iyar. That's the second month. Now, I agree that Rome was advancing by this time in the siege, but we know the last wall wasn't broke through until the 8th of Av. That's the 5th month. And the temple wasn't destroyed until the 9th of Av. Wouldn't it make more sense that this would have been seen on the last and most horrible day and not 2.5 months before? I mean, Yeshua's account in the Gospels and in Revelation all implies he'll be seen at the end of it all, like we see here in Matthew's account. It's after the distress of those days. Again, after the distress of those days. That's when he's seen, at the end of it all. Plus, Yeshua is never seen in the account. Now, I agree, it's a fascinating account, but where's Yeshua? I mean, Yeshua said they would see him. So the timing is off, and we're missing the star of the show. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying Josephus didn't see a sign of judgment coming on Jerusalem. That's very possible. Even the servant of Elisha saw the spiritual forces of Yahweh in the surrounding hills. So, yeah, Yahweh can open the eyes of anyone to the spiritual realm to show them the judgment that's coming. And let's not forget, Josephus was acting as a mediator. Maybe Yahweh was giving Josephus and his colleagues a vision of what was about to happen to embolden him with a passion as a mediator. I don't know. I'm simply showing it wasn't the account Yeshua said will happen at his coming. It was the wrong time, and Yeshua wasn't there. Now, the exact same account was recorded by the Roman historian Tacitus. You can easily see the similarities between the two. However, he predicates his account with a rather ambiguous sentence that implies it's not a first-hand observance of his own, but rather from one who believes in superstition, possibly referring to the account given to us from Josephus. Remember, Josephus had defected to Rome, so that's possible. But again, the timing is off, and Yeshua wasn't seen. Next, this generation. Preterism says the phrase, "this generation," used by Yeshua in Matthew 24, is the nail in the coffin for any other end-time belief. However, this actually goes right in line with what we just covered. Let's read the verses. Matthew 24, starting in verse 32. "Now, learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." Along with this verse, They'll often reference what Yeshua said when he was on trial too. So let's read that one as well. Matthew 26, starting in verse 63. But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Yes, it is as you say, Jesus replied. But I say to all of you, in the future, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Okay, let's first address the seemingly obvious statement made when Yeshua was on trial. Many will say, look, he said it right here that they would see him. I mean, it doesn't get any more obvious than that. However, they seem to forget what was said to those who came out of Egypt under Moses. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15. Yahweh your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own brothers. You must listen to him, for this is what you asked of Yahweh your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, let us not hear the voice of Yahweh our God, nor see this great fire any more, or we will die. Yahweh said to me, what they say is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command him. If anyone does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name, I myself will call him to account. Okay, think about it. He said this to that specific generation regarding Yeshua's first coming, an event that wouldn't happen for another 1,500 years. 1,500 years. This clearly shows he was addressing Israel as a whole. But they could have easily understood it to be directed at that generation only. Now, some have tried to attribute this statement in Deuteronomy about the coming of the prophet to Joshua. But Joshua wasn't a prophet like Moses. In fact, Deuteronomy says, since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses. So it couldn't have been Joshua. And we can't forget, Moses was a prophet that brought a new covenant to Israel. Joshua didn't do that. But that was the very purpose of Yeshua's coming, to pave the way for the new covenant. But the generation under Moses was specifically told a prophet like Moses would rise up from among their own brothers. Their own brothers. Because they asked for it. And he said they must listen to him. So, what were they to think? Like I said, many have mistakenly attributed it to Joshua, but it didn't come to pass until 1,500 years later. So, was Moses addressing a generation or a people? A people. And now we see Yeshua, the prophet likened unto Moses, say virtually the same thing, saying those specific leaders would see him coming in the clouds for the completion of that covenant, the marriage of the Lamb. But was he addressing a generation or a people? A people. Knowing his first coming didn't happen until 1,500 years after it was clearly foretold to a specific generation. Is it really that hard to believe his second coming won't happen for 2,000 years after it was foretold to that specific generation? But this goes in alignment with how Peter explains Yahweh's timing. He's not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand time. He's patient, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. The same principle is truly applied to the verse in Matthew 24. Yeshua is saying the generation that sees the beginning of the end sees it to the end. When the signs come, they'll proceed quickly. They won't be stretched out over several generations. It all takes place for one generation. However, if we're to believe Yeshua's talking about the very generation who was hearing his words, then we're making Yeshua contradict himself. How? Yeshua specifically said that generation of his day would only be given one sign. What sign is that? The sign of Jonah. 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. This was the only sign that specific generation would be given to see. That generation wasn't going to see the sign of his coming. Plus, this parallels what Yeshua said in Acts chapter 1. He specifically told the disciples, "It is not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority." It wasn't for them to know. It simply wasn't for that generation. Period. They were to focus on spreading the word. The hope of his return remained in them, yes. They just wouldn't know when. And the angels never said they would see him coming the way he had left. They simply said that's how he would return. Yeshua just told them it wasn't for them. If they were told it wasn't going to happen for another 2,000 years, how would that have impacted them? How would that have impacted their listeners? And if they saw his return, then they would have known. But Yeshua said it wasn't for them to know the times or the dates. And this takes us back to our point made with Daniel. Just like the disciples, Daniel didn't know or understand either. He was told it would be sealed up until the end. Thus, no one would know and fully understand until it all happened. But if it happened in 70 AD, then that means the disciples would have known, because at least John was there in 70 AD. But Yeshua said it wasn't for any of them to know the times or dates. This is even made evident with John not giving what the 7 thunders spoke in Revelation chapter 10. He was told not to write it down, just like Daniel was told to seal up the vision. To this day, no one knows what the 7 thunders said. Showing us what? It's sealed up until the end. Because if the end had already happened, as the preterists believe, then, as given to Daniel, the wise would know and understand all the mysteries, including what the 7 thunders said. After all prophecy concerning Yeshua's return is completed, there will be no questions. Why? Because as the prophets said, knowledge of him will cover the earth as the waters cover the seas. There will be no questions as to what happened. All will be made known. Next, the Mount of Transfiguration. Another set of verses often referred to is found in Matthew 16. They give the account that's often referred to as the Mount of Transfiguration. They read, "For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what he has done." I tell you the truth, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Well, there you go, Steve. See, it says it right there. But the problem is, no one can answer how Yeshua rewarded each person according to what they had done in 70 AD. It's often just glossed over as something spiritual. But I mean, that's a big element to just gloss over and spiritualize. And there's no agreement between many of them in how it was a spiritual thing. They just say it was spiritual. But they have to spiritualize it because there's nothing to show it happened in 70 AD. Plus, in saying it had to happen in 70 AD, they make Yeshua contradict himself to the disciples in Acts 1 regarding them not knowing the times and dates, and to the Pharisees seeing only one sign. But more than this, they completely mock any reference to the verses that immediately follow, verses that give context. Let's read from the next verse. Matthew 17:1. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah, talking with Jesus. Please focus your attention on verse 2 here for a moment. Please notice how it says his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Now, please look at what John saw later in Revelation. See any resemblance? Of course you do. And yet, we're told to completely ignore these verses that immediately follow as coincidence. Next, the book of Revelation. One of the foundations to the preterist position is the belief that the book of Revelation was actually written before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And they have to believe that. However, this belief denies the evidence that opposes it. The history of the Roman Empire and the testimony of the early church fathers both point to a date of its writing around 95 AD. That's 25 years after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Widespread persecution from Rome on the church, as pictured in Revelation, didn't occur until the reign of Domitian, and the persecutions of Nero were mainly focused on the area of Rome. Irenaeus was discipled by Polycarp, who, as noted earlier, was discipled by John himself. Irenaeus wrote that the book of Revelation was written by the Apostle John toward the end of Domitian's reign. Domitian reigned from 81 to 96 AD. This can be traced back to Eusebius in his writing Ecclesiastical History. And speaking of the persecution under the Roman Emperor Domitian, Eusebius states, "In this persecution, it is handed down by tradition that the Apostle John, who was yet living, in consequence of his testimony to the divine word, was condemned to dwell on the island of Patmos. Irenaeus, indeed, in his 5th book against the heresies, where he speaks of the calculation formed on the epithet of, in the above-mentioned revelation of John, speaks in the following manner respecting him. If, however, it were necessary to proclaim his name, i.e., Antichrist, openly at the present time, it would have been declared by him who saw the revelation, for it is not long since it was seen, but almost in our own generation at the close of Domitian's reign." This is huge evidence in showing the believers of that time understood the book of Revelation to be written between 94 to 96 AD. However, preterists know they have nothing to give from the early church to defend their view of it being written before 70 AD. They're quick to reference Revelation chapter 1, verse 7, which says, "Those who pierced him would see him." They argue those people weren't alive in 95 AD because they were killed in the Roman-Jewish War of 70 AD. They say this is clear evidence that Revelation had to be written before 70 AD. Yet, Who does Peter say crucified Yeshua? He said it was Israel, seen here in Acts 2:36 and Acts 4:10. So, who pierced him? Israel. This goes right back to the question, who was he addressing? A generation or a people? And it's clear, once again, it was a people, Israel. And though they use this argument to defend the timing of it being written, they often spiritualize the part that says, every eye will see him. And they have to do this because no one saw him come in the clouds. Next, Revelation shows the harlot getting destroyed by fire, burned in one day. Preterists say the harlot was Jerusalem, and it happened on the 9th of Av when the temple was burned down. Revelation says the harlot gets burned by the beast and the 10 kings. So, the harlot gets destroyed by the beast. And then we see Yahweh gives the beast and the 10 horns their power to rule until God's words are fulfilled. So, the beast and the 10 horns rule for a time after the harlot is destroyed. This tells us Armageddon isn't when the harlot gets destroyed, but rather when the beast gets destroyed. According to Revelation, the harlot is destroyed long before Armageddon. So, Yeshua goes to battle at Armageddon against the beast and the 10 horns, those who he allowed to destroy the harlot. He doesn't go to battle against the harlot. That being the case, when do we see Yeshua destroying Rome when he came in 70 AD? We don't. Remember, Yeshua said it would all be seen by one generation, not spread out over decades or even centuries. Rome wasn't overthrown until 476 AD, over 400 years later. We must also note the death of the beast, also known as the Antichrist. While preterists differ on who they say the Antichrist was, none of their options match the death to the one shown in Revelation. Revelation says he's thrown alive into the lake of fire. This obviously didn't happen to any of their runner-ups. And while they mock at this to be something that literally happens, they forget it's happened already. Remember, Isaiah 46:10 says, he makes known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come. So, where do we see something like this happening before? We see it with Korah. He was literally cast directly into Sheol alive, where he would have experienced his physical death, and then his spirit would remain until the time of judgment. But did you see how the verse in Revelation says it's the beast and the false prophet who gets thrown into the lake of fire? Why? I believe very strongly the false prophet will be the high priest in Jerusalem during the last days. You see, in the account of Korah and his followers, the people were given a warning. The exact same fate of Korah will be given to anyone who is not a descendant of Aaron, yet burned incense before Yahweh. The same judgment. It was already established back in Exodus that only the priesthood of Aaron was to offer incense on the altar of incense that stood before the Ark of the Covenant. So, that would explain why the false prophet gets thrown into the lake of fire. He's wrongfully serving as high priest. But why does the Antichrist get thrown in too? This verse only applies to those who wrongfully go into the temple to burn incense. Well, what do we read about the Antichrist from Paul? That's right. The Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, exalts himself over everything that is called God. Meaning what? He takes the authority for himself, just like Korah did. and does what he wants in the temple. It says he even sets himself up in the temple, which means he sets himself up as a high priest. He even claims himself to be God. And that's why we see these two individuals thrown into the lake of fire. Yahweh warned it would happen, and we see it will. Remember, Korah opposed Moses. He tried to usurp Moses' authority, which is exactly what the Antichrist does. He usurps the authority of Yeshua, the prophet likened unto Moses. And that's why we'll see the Noahide laws enforced by the Antichrist. The Antichrist will oppose all who follow in obedience to Yeshua. We must understand, though we see the spirit of Antichrist in the world, the Antichrist will be a specific person. Paul describes him in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 8 through 10. His coming will be in accordance with the work of Satan, displayed in all kinds of counterfeit miracles, signs, and wonders. Paul was giving the people what to look for, and they never saw it in the first century. This is important to note. There's so much more in the book of Revelation that could be covered, but I believe these few accounts we've given shows abundant evidence in themselves there's no way the millennium has already passed, and we're now supposedly in that time when Satan is loosed for a short season. Next, Matthew 24. Though we've already covered some verses from Matthew, there are more we can address. Now, we won't be looking at all of them, but let's take a look at a few key verses. Matthew 24, verse 9. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. The key phrase to focus on here is, for my name's sake. We know 70 AD was a hard and horrible time for the Jews, but it didn't come because they held to the name of Yeshua. Not even close. Remember what's given to us in Revelation. The enemy pursues those who keep God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Yeshua. Not only did the majority of the Jews in first century Jerusalem not believe in Yeshua, they let go of the commands of Yahweh and held more to the oral traditions, that which later became known as the Talmud. Next, Matthew 24:15. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in the house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. To this day, there are different views of what the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel is. However, we see it's supposed to be standing in the holy place. The preterist view has different opinions as well. But setting all those opinions to the side, let's focus on the timing. Yeshua said, when you see the abomination standing in the holy place, that's when you run. That's when you flee to the mountains. According to the preterist view of the abomination of desolation, it couldn't have happened until after Rome conquered Jerusalem. That's when Rome was able to set the abomination of desolation in the holy place. So, according to how the preterists interpret Yeshua's words here, believers didn't have to run until the city was conquered. But we know that doesn't make sense. How can anyone flee to the mountains when you're already surrounded? As I've said before, the abomination of desolation is what starts everything off. It won't be after Jerusalem is conquered, as preterism teaches. Next verse, verse 21. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be. Verse 21 says it would be the worst tribulation the world would ever see. As noted already, we know the destruction of Jerusalem was a horrible time for the Jews, but it wasn't the worst the world would ever see. Rome began surrounding Jerusalem just before Passover. It's reported they were letting people into Jerusalem, but they weren't letting anyone out. This resulted in just under 1 million Jews being in Jerusalem for the Feast of Passover, and eventually the invasion. Now, compare that to World War II, where 6 million Jews were killed. It's hardly a comparison. Next, the signs of the sun, moon, and the stars didn't happen in 70 AD. Genesis tells us these were to be for signs. So Yeshua is not talking about something spiritual here. He's referencing what they were designed for. And verse 30 says, all the nations of the earth will mourn at Yeshua's return. Nothing of the like is recorded of this in 70 AD. And, as noted before, no one saw Yeshua when it was at the end of the invasion on Jerusalem. And nowhere is there record of Yeshua gathering his elect. This is something the preterists spiritualize, because they have to. History is cyclical. It's always pointing in patterns. Ecclesiastes 1:9. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Jerusalem has been surrounded, invaded, and destroyed many times throughout history, all pointing to the final battle of all time. We also know that there were many antichrists before, and yet they all point to the final one to come. Yahweh makes known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come. To close this teaching out, we know Moses gave the Torah. He then passed that baton on to Joshua. However, Joshua never passed that role of leadership on. We then see the days of the judges, the time when it was said, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And then we see Yeshua, the prophet likened unto Moses, and he taught the Torah. He then passed that baton to the disciples. But, like Joshua, we never see the disciples pass that leadership on. And so we see ourselves today in a time likened unto the judges, when everyone is doing what's right in our own eyes. And we know that's where we're at. It's evident. There's no unity in the body of Messiah. But under the preterist mentality, they remove that parallel to the days of the judges playing out. That which we know is evident to all around, for everyone is truly doing what's right in their own eyes. But they say Yeshua has been reigning with peace ever since instead. They don't realize how they're contradicting what's given to us in Acts chapter 20. Acts 20:29. I know that after I leave, savage wolves will come in among you and will not spare the flock. Even from your own number, men will arise and distort the truth in order to draw away disciples after them. Showing us what? The days of the judges, men doing what's right in their own eyes, would begin after the days of the apostles. All this to say, there is no way we can be in the season when Satan is released at the end of the millennium, because we haven't even gotten to the Battle of Armageddon, let alone the millennium, or the season where Satan gets released. Well, that's all I have. Think about it. Pray about it. But more than anything, be a doer of the word and not a hearer only. Until next time, Shalom.